I'm going to use this whiteboard the same way you'll use your notepad. So what I'm going to do is give you a formula that I've been working on for about 5 years, and it's how to make sense of your sorrow. So I started doing workshops about 5 years ago, and I've had just over 3,500 people come to the workshops, and I've asked every single person, if you have ever experienced sorrow, raise your hand. No one has yet not raised their hand. What I'm really looking for is my mentor, because the person who doesn't experience sorrow is the one I want to go figure out, what the hell are you doing? Because I want to go do that. But we live in a world of duality, you know this. So if you have joy, you have to have sorrow. The question is how do you make sense of it when it happens? And so how I'm going to write out on this whiteboard, hopefully, I'm going to draw out the formula and go through it so that you get to see it, not only hear it, right? Because if you go home and take this formula with you, I think you'll always be able to make sense of your sorrow by holding yourself accountable to this formula and seeing where you're at. That's what I think. The other thing that I'll probably use a lot, because it just happens, is I'll use usually stories of Jesus. That's not to promulgate any particular organized religion. I think that Jesus embodied Christ consciousness maybe better than anyone else that's ever lived. An interesting thing, something that was very interesting to me is that, and I learned this years ago, and it was like, it was a simple thought, and that is that Christ is not Jesus' last name, right? That was like such a big, profound thing for me. And the other thing, too, is that I might go over a couple things, so I'll just set the table for it if I do go over it, and that is, anytime I'm talking about the ancient records, it's usually scriptures, and the New Testament was the most ancient writings of the New Testament we have in Greek, in ancient Greek. And the most ancient writings of the Old Testament we have in ancient Hebrew, in those two languages. And so, So I've been working on a formula of how to make sense of sorrow for over 5 years. That came from, I was with an organization that rescues children from child sex trafficking. I was with that organization for 3 years. We traveled all over different parts of the world. And to me, I think that child sex trafficking is the bottom of the barrel when it comes to human behavior and the shadows that we get stuck in and the things that we do in our shadows. An interesting thing that led me to this was that 50% of all children that were rescued could not be returned home because that's where they were trafficked from. And so really difficult things happen, and the things that I learned from these children as they were rescued, and this ranged anywhere from 6 months old to 17 years old, were being rescued. And I saw some children were struggling deeply with the difficulties that their life had happened to them. And I saw other children that had the same experience, and they were just as joyful and happy, and it was almost like they'd never seen it. And I wondered for a long time, what's the difference? And the difference was how one child viewed what had happened and how another child had viewed what had happened, and that was really the only difference. Now, why some were wired to think of it differently than others, I don't know. And here's what's interesting about trauma, is according to the cutting edge data in the research, is that trauma is not the event that happened. Trauma is the negative judgment of the event that happened. So how fast does it take to get trauma? How fast is it to get traumatized? Like that fast. So how fast is it to get untraumatized? Like that fast. Right? That's a hard thing for us to comprehend. So the formula is going to show you how we do that. Trauma is not the event that took place. Trauma is the negative judgment about the event that took place. Okay, so if this were your notebook, this is how I would take the notes. In fact, let me demonstrate. This is how I drew it out. I would open up, and you're going to write on this side, and you're going to write on this side. So this is the full formula, but you need both pieces of paper. So if this were this, I'm just going to kind of draw a little line down the middle so you can kind of see what's on what side. And the other thing, too, is if anything pops to you, you have any questions or whatever, just be like, hey, dive in on that a little bit, because I'm going to just float over it, but we can dive in on any part of it that you guys want. So, this is just our dividing line, right? So up here on the top left of the corner, I want you to write 4 words: abandonment, abuse, betrayal, rejection. Abandonment, I'm going to try to write it big. Abandonment, abuse, betrayal, rejection. Anyone read the Old Testament before? It's painful. Where do these 4 words show up? In what book? The story of Adam and Eve, and also Isaiah 53. He was a man of sorrows. This is what Isaiah is talking about. The guy who's going to come hundreds of years later and embody Christ's consciousness. This is how he describes him. He says he's going to be a man of sorrows. What's the opposite of sorrow? How come he didn't say he's going to be a man of joy? He's going to be a man of sorrow, and he's going to be well acquainted with grief. What's grief? It's the process of trying to make sense of the sorrow. Grief is a process. So if you're a man of sorrow, what process are you often in? The grieving process. So you would be well acquainted with grief if you are a man of sorrow. Does that make sense? And guess what you are? A woman of sorrow, right? Or a man of sorrow. And you've been in the grieving process a lot, maybe still there. And so what's happening to Adam and Eve is the same thing that's happening to you and I. What's happening to the man named Jesus is what's happening to you. The thing is, you just may not be aware of it, or you might not recognize it, because there's a lot of othering that goes on, right? And so it's like, oh, it's him that's over there, not me. But what Jesus said to Thomas, remember, Thomas is the guy that doubted. He doubted one time, and then he gets stuck with the bad reputation from here on out. And he also wrote a book, which is known as The Lost Gospel of Thomas. And if you haven't read it, you should. It's 1 chapter long. It's 90 some odd verses. And it's basically what I call the first Pinterest account that was ever created. It's just a bunch of Jesus quotes, just one after another. In fact, there's not really any succinct story that really takes place in his Lost Gospel. But what he does say is, he says he was chatting with Jesus and he asked Jesus, where is the kingdom of God? And Jesus says, well, Thomas, if you think the kingdom is in the heavens, then the birds precede you because they fly and you don't. And if you think that the kingdom is in the sea, then the fishes precede you because they swim and go underwater and you don't. But I tell you, Thomas, that the kingdom of God is inside of you. Right? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the light. But remember when Jesus also said, light cannot be hid up on a hill, and you can't put the little candlelight under the bush. The scripture before that, he said, you are the light. See, there's no othering. It's inside of you, and I'm the light, and so are you. That's what's really being said. Okay? So then Isaiah goes on and says he will suffer abandonment, abuse, betrayal, and rejection. So where does trauma come from? Abandonment, abuse, betrayal, and rejection. Think about your trauma that you've experienced. Can you tie it back to one of those? Totally. Totally. What do these lead to? If you summarized it, I'll try to get my spacing correct. I think someone said it. So if you've gone through abandonment, abuse, betrayal, or rejection, you'll have sorrow. What is sorrow? Sorrow is really easy. It comes from loss. So if you think about your trauma, why did you judge it negatively? Well, just think about what you feel like you lost. And when you lost it, maybe that was the marriage, maybe that was the child, maybe that was the innocence, maybe that was whatever it was. And when you lost it, what did the loss feel like? Pain. So now just draw an arrow down, because it's our little formula, and just write pain. Sorrow feels like pain, and pain brings a whole unique set of emotions. And you're an emotional being, first and foremost. You're a Homo sapien, and also you're a sentient being. You know what sentient means? A being that feels emotions. So above and beyond everything, what you are is an emotional being. Let me prove it to you. What would a first kiss feel like if you had no emotions? What would the divorce feel like if you had no emotions? What would the scary roller coaster at Magic Mountain feel like if you had no emotions? Nothing. What would holding the child in your arms for the first time feel like if you had no emotions? Do you see how you're an emotional being first and foremost? So, abandonment, abuse, betrayal, rejection, something happened, you feel like you lost, it came with pain, and pain brings what? Emotions. I think there's two types of emotions. I call them shadow emotions and sunshine emotions. We're going to talk about shadow emotions for a second. Anyone listen to Brene Brown or read any of her research? Most of my definitions come from her research. Shadow emotions. There's approximately 89 to 90 total emotions. Since we live in the world of duality, if you have one emotion, you have to have the other type of emotion, right? If you have pain, then you have pleasure. If you have sorrow, you have joy, right? It's the world of duality. So here's what they say the three core shadow emotions are. So pain brings shadow emotions. And this is what I would do, is I would draw a little line, and then I would write shadow emotions. And then you can do a little cloud, right? And here's what the core three shadow emotions are. Fear, anger. Anyone want to guess the third one? And sadness. Fear, anger, and sadness. Who's felt fear? Raise your hands. Who's felt sadness? Raise your hands. Who's felt anger? Raise your hands. When you were a little child and the first time you felt fear, anger, or sadness, who sat down with you and taught you how to face and feel that? It's what you are. You see how we are an emotional being. And when you felt fear as a little child, or anger or sadness, who taught you how to make peace with that? Do you see why the trauma is the negative judgment? And the reason it's a negative judgment, because what did you feel? Fear, anger, or sadness. And who taught you how to face and feel those emotions? So what would you do with those emotions? What do you do with them? I'll tell you what I do with them. I avoid them and I ignore them. Right? That's what I did for a long time. And when you avoid and you ignore those kinds of situations, there's an interesting thing that starts to happen. So no one taught you, no one mentored with you, and no one showed you how to face and feel them. So what you did naturally, this is what the human brain does naturally, is we want to find safety. And in safety, that doesn't feel safe, so I'm going to get away from it, and I'm going to avoid it, and I'm going to ignore it. So maybe in parentheses right here, you could just say avoid and ignore. Now, when you've had your sorrow, after the sorrow, did you ever feel, or have you ever felt bitterness or resentment? Have you ever experienced bitterness or resentment? Totally. Here's what Brene Brown says. If you have bitterness or resentment, it is because you have pain in the past that you have not faced and felt. Why haven't you faced and felt it? Because you've been avoiding and ignoring it. Why have you been avoiding and ignoring it? Because no one showed you how to face and feel it. You're just a little child, and then you did what worked, and then you just keep repeating what works. And then here's the challenge. Who here has level Jesus inner peace? This is a really interesting thing. I've also asked that question to everyone. No one has it. I don't have it, right? Level Jesus inner peace.
Do you actually think that Jesus had inner peace, or that he was just constantly adapting and doing what was best and teaching people how to deal with their sorrow as he was dealing with his sorrow?
I think it's a wrestle.
Yeah.
Remember Jacob's ladder, the ladder of ascension within? That's really what Jacob's ladder is all about. And what did Jacob do in the Old Testament? He wrestled. And who did he wrestle with? God. And where's the kingdom of God? Inside of himself. What was he wrestling with? Himself. The shadow emotions. What happened in the wrestle? Jacob's hip was dislocated. What's the strongest, most fortified joint in the human body? The hip. You see the message that's being, how bad is that wrestle? It's so bad you would dislocate your hip. It's not really saying God was like super awesome at wrestling. Like that's not really the message. It's saying that's how difficult it actually is. So do I think that, going back to the question, do I think that Jesus walked around with inner peace? No, not at all. But here's what's interesting. At the very end, at the Last Supper, what did he say? My peace I leave with you. Here's what he did not say. My love I leave with you. Why would he say peace and not love? Because he had made the wrestle. And once you make the wrestle, what's the wrestle? Becoming at one with all that you are. And once you finally realize that there is no judgment to it, and it's like, oh, well, there's no judgment. And then what is really the result of peace? No judgment. I don't judge it. Right? Where's the wrestle? I'm judging something. Right? So, fear, anger, and sadness comes. These are just the core. There's just a whole bunch more. Disappointment, right? There's all kinds of stuff that's there. But no one taught us how to face and feel, so by nature, what we are is really, really good students, and you probably could go and ask your parents or whoever was your guardian and your mentor, and you would say, hey, who taught you how to face and feel your shadow emotions? And they would probably say, no one. So it's not that you're a bad student, it's that you're actually being mentored on how to avoid and ignore. And that shows up in a whole lot of different ways, and that's okay. We're just going to change that. Okay? So you have your shadow emotions, and then you have fear, anger, and sadness. And when you have fear, anger, and sadness, and you want to avoid and get away from it, then what happens? The human mind, Brandon talked about this earlier, the human mind has to do something really, really important for the human mind. No other creature on the planet has to do this with their brain. Only the human mind is capable of doing this. We have to tell a story. And you know why you tell a story? Because you got to figure out why. Why did this happen? And so in an effort to try to figure out why this happened, why am I experiencing this sorrow? The very first thing you're going to do is complain. Think about what you lost, the pain that it felt, and then I don't know how to face it and feel it, so what am I going to do with it? I'm going to go complain about it. So here's the definition of complaining. Complaining is the expedient way to talk about your pain. Complaining is just the expedient way to talk about pain. So when you hear someone talking about pain, or when you hear someone complaining, now what you can do is be like, oh, they have pain somewhere, and that's okay. They don't know how to face and feel it. Right? So the first thing that happens right here is that I have to tell a story, and the story, since these are my shadow emotions, I've got to tell what I call a shadow story. And here's how the shadow story goes. It's really easy. I complain, and that's just a way to talk about pain, so it's okay. But once I start complaining, what am I going to find? Where the problems are. That's called fault finding. What's fault finding? Blame. That's right. So complain is a way to talk about pain. blame is to find fault or fault finding. And if I find fault, what have I just done? I identified all the evidence of why you weren't enough or why it wasn't enough. I just found the evidence. And what does the human mind want? It wants all the evidence. Okay? So if I complain, I blame, and then once I blame, I find the fault, I figure out where the brake pads didn't work, and then I'm going to call the dealership, and I'm going to prove to them, and I'm going to go get my lawyer. Or I'm going to go and get my lawyer, and I'm going to be like, she's a narcissist, or he's got, there's all this name calling and labeling that we do with each other. And so then we start, tearing each other down. And now it should have been better, and that means is that it wasn't enough. So when the pain of the divorce came, I went and told all my friends all about my pain. And to make the story make sense, I talked about all of her faults. And that gave me my evidence of why we were going through our divorce. And if she would have just been better, and now I just shamed her. If you complain, you'll blame, and if you blame, you'll shame. And shame just simply means not enough. Could have been better. Well, how is God in the detail of your life if things could have been better? Right? And if the kingdom of God is inside you, well, then where's God at? He lives in the kingdom. Or she lives in the kingdom. You see what I'm saying? And so you can't be a co-creator when you're a victim. Does that make sense? So if I complain, I blame, and then I shame. And if I shame, then it's really easy. It's like a math problem. I have judgment. And because it's a shadow judgment, also known as a negative judgment. Trauma is not the event that happened, it's the negative judgment of the event that happened. And so I have all the evidence to prove it, and so now I just go back through, and then I loop, and she was a narcissist, and I have all my evidence, and I can't get out of the story, and I'm looping, and I'm looping, and I'm looping, and I never find my inner peace, and then we have lots of anxiety, and then we do the sound bowls, and that helps for a bit. Then the damn thing comes back. Then I'm walking around with sound bowls all day long, right? And then you do the cold plunge, and that helps. But then the problem comes back because it's the story that you tell. See, you are the healer. If you are the medicine, you're also the poison. It just depends on how you tell the story. And what you're happening over here is, what did all of this teach you? And the answer is nothing. It's torturing you. That's why you can't make peace with it. You're tortured by what happened rather than taught. And it's because you have negative judgments about what's going on. And that's okay. It's only miserable. Right? So Jesus, I'm kind of like a Lord of the Rings nerd, and so I love the Fellowship of the Rings. So one day, even make this make more sense. About 5 years ago, I went into the inner library and I got a download in the inner library, and the inner library told me on the inside, you need to rewrite the New Testament for your children. Because if anyone's ever read the New Testament, it's heavy and heady, and we don't speak the language that way anymore. And the translation is accurate, but it often is very difficult and it's hard to wrestle with. So let me give you an example. In Matthew, Jesus starts talking Matthew chapter 5 is where the Sermon of the Mount, which is known as his most famous, popular sermon that he ever gives. It's 5, 6, and 7. And in 5, he goes over to this hillside, and all these people start gathering, and he starts talking to them. And then you get into the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are these, and blessed are they. And then it says, blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Raise your hand if you've ever mourned. So we're all mourning. Here's what the Greek word says. The Greek word for mourn is two words that are combined into one to make this really special kind of word that doesn't exist in English. So the word mourning isn't really the word that we would use when you look at the definition of what is actually trying to be said. The Greek word for mourn means two things. It's to have a unique type of grief. There's the grieving process. It's a unique type of grief. If you have grief, what also do you have? Sorrow and loss. And so something really unfortunate, unfair, and unjust happened to you. If you're mourning, what it's really talking about is this right here. And then this other word that's used in Greek is the word for guilt. So to mourn in Greek means to have a grief and guilt. And what it's saying is that a better translation, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, is blessed are they who have gone through deep sorrow and have been in the grieving process and learned how they were guilty and can take accountability for their role in the situation. And if they can take accountability for their role in the situation, they won't repeat that again. And if they don't repeat that again, they'll find comfort. Reads a little differently, right? Here's another example. I love these because I've spent years retranslating the New Testament for my kids. Here's another example. So we go through the Beatitudes, and then Jesus is like, okay, here's what you guys got to understand about you. Before I can dive further into the Sermon on the Mount, you're not going to get it unless you can get you. And he says, be ye therefore perfect, Matthew 5:48. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's English. That's King James. Want to know what it says in Greek? Be ye therefore whole, realizing that you lack no parts and are complete as you are. That's what it says in Greek. In the 1600s, when they were translating from Greek to English, the word perfect meant whole, complete, lacking no parts. Today, when you hear the word perfect, what do you hear? Flawless. What you hear is, be ye therefore flawless, even as your heavenly Father is flawless. That's what you hear. That's what I hear too. But actually, perfection means wholeness, not flawlessness. So what it's saying is, hey, you got to understand that when you get into the wrestle, you're going to see your shadows and you're going to see your shine. And you got to make peace with all of that. And you got to realize that everything is whole as it is. Here's the other thing that it's saying in Matthew 5:48. It says, be ye therefore. Here's what it does not say. Become. It doesn't say become whole. It says be whole. Here's a better translation. Own your wholeness, realizing that you are complete, lacking no parts. Even as your parents in heaven are complete, lacking no parts. That's what he's trying to say. You can't understand the rest of the sermon until you understand one critical thing. You are whole exactly as you are, and you don't have to be anything different. What you do have to do is wrestle with your wholeness and your shadows. So if we are emotional beings, what are we really wrestling with? The shadow emotions from really difficult experiences. Because if we didn't have the shadow emotions and you went through the really difficult experience, what would it feel like? Nothing. You wouldn't care. If you didn't have the emotions, how would you ever feel the loss? So actually, what we've all signed up for to come here to the earth experience is exactly what you're getting. And so why would you ever have to be anything different? And so you don't. You just have to wrestle with your wholeness and realize, yeah, this is exactly who I am. Now, here's an interesting thing. When you wrestle with your wholeness, it does not generate apathy. It only generates empathy. The old generation and the old way of thinking about things is that if I own my wholeness, well, then I'll just make excuses for my shadows and my dumb fuckery behavior, and then I'll just keep on doing that dumb shit, and then don't judge me, I'm fine, right? And that's ridiculous, and that's apathetic, right? Because that's not actually what any of us do. No one wakes up and is like, I'm just going to go do dumb things, right? Because when you have empathy for all that you are and what you are, you then actually love more, and then you spread that more, right? Okay, so here's where we get to judgment. So what we're trying to do is make sense of this. This is what happens, right? Is this like what has happened in your life? You agree with the formula? Here's how I got the formula. I was reading in John chapter 14, verse 12. Here's what John 14:12 says. I'll just read it to you. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in my way will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. That's a promise from the one who embodied Christ's consciousness better than anyone else. Greater things you will do than what you have seen me do. That's King James's version. Has anyone seen anyone doing, or have you done greater miracles than what Jesus has done? So that's a problem, right? We're supposed to be doing it. If we actually believe that he is the way, the truth, and the light, then we would have to say, oh, well, we have to make sense of these things. So I was really trying to figure out, why am I not even seeing those things, let alone greater things? And not in your life, but in my own life. So I had to take accountability for it. And this is what came to me. What came to me was, well, those are miracles, and I'm not doing the miracles, and I'm not seeing anybody do those miracles, and I'm not saying they don't exist, I'm saying I haven't seen them. And so I just was doing this logic in my own little brain, and what happened was, my little inner library, I swiped my library card, and the inner library opened up, and I got another little download. And this is what I heard. And it came as a feeling. I always say I heard the feeling, because that's how it works for me. I heard the feeling, and this is what the feeling said. The first healing miracle Jesus ever performed was healing his own emotional wounds and traumas. And that came to me. I'd never thought of anything even remotely close to that. And imagine like a 5-year-old, innocent 5-year-old child. This is the state I was in. I wasn't trying to argue or anything like that. I said back to the feeling, no, that's not true. The first healing miracle Jesus ever performed was healing his own emotional wounds and traumas. That's the feeling I heard. I said back, no, that's not true. Jesus is flawless. And this is what came back. He was a man of sorrow, well acquainted with grief. He was abandoned, abused, betrayed, and rejected. How could he not have emotional wounds and traumas from experiences like that? And I said, because he's flawless. That's really what I said. And I heard the feeling say back to me, then he would not have had the full human experience and therefore would not be relatable to anybody. And then I was like, oh shit. Jesus had emotional wounds and traumas. Now here's an interesting thing. When you're a child, you cannot abandon yourself, betray yourself, abuse yourself, or reject yourself when you're a child. But as an adult, you cannot be in a relationship that you feel abandoned, abused, betrayed, or rejected without having first done it to yourself. Want me to say that again? So this does not apply for children, because the children are subject to their environment. But as an adult, you cannot be in a relationship where you experience abandonment, abuse, betrayal, or rejection without having first done those things to yourself. When you abandon yourself, you then find yourself in relationships that reciprocate that relationship with you. When you abuse yourself, you reciprocate that. You find yourself in relationships that reciprocate that kind of relationship. Your self-relationship is your first and foremost. And all of the abandonment, the abuse, the betrayal, and the rejection that's taking place in your life is coming first from you as an adult. Does that make sense? Heavy stuff. That's a wrestle. Enjoy the dislocated hip. You're welcome. I'm gone. So, I'll let you write some of those notes down. Any thoughts or questions on that? Yep.
So, as I just swiped my library card,
Yeah.
You asked the question, or you made the statement from the scripture, greater miracles than these we will do.
Yeah.
And you asked if any of us have performed those miracles.
Yeah.
And honestly, at this point, I would have to say yes.
Yeah.
Because I've told my heart to beat
Mm.
again. I've told myself to live again.
Yeah.
After having been dead.
Yeah.
Emotionally, spiritually, whatever.
Yeah.
So, have I not performed the same kind of miracle?
Totally. Totally. So he's doing it. Now you all got permission to go do it yourself. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I don't doubt that they're there. Right? Remember, the thing that Jesus always said, and I love that you said that. So who healed you? Yeah. This is what Jesus said if you go dive into the Greek. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Every time he performed a miracle, he never said, I did it, you're welcome. He never said that. He said, thy faith hath made thee whole. So when he's performing the miracle, what he's doing is helping them realize who they are. That's how you perform the miracle. Okay? So, let's whip through the other side of this formula real quick. It's really, really simple. I'm not going to show you anything that you don't already know. You'll fill in the blanks. All we got to do is to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? That's like Newton's third law. We're living in the world of duality, so what's the opposite of abandonment? Belonging. Let's just go down the list. Opposite of abuse, nurture. Opposite of betrayal, loyal. Opposite of rejection, acceptance. Have you all felt these? Yeah, you have. Okay? When we have these types of experiences, what do they bring? Joy, right? What is joy? If sorrow is loss, what is joy? Abundance. Okay? If sorrow brings pain, what does joy bring? Pleasure. Right? And when joy and abundance and pleasure and belonging and everything, do you avoid and ignore that? No, you face and feel it. You're like, this is awesome. Just bring that in. Right? So what you do is face and feel this. And so then if pleasure comes in, what kind of emotions does pleasure bring? I call it sunshine emotion. Right? And then you're going to have your shine story. Right? This is like when you're dating and then everything feels super good and you're like, I met the man of my dreams. It's the sunshine story, right? Everything is great. So how do we tell the sunshine story? What's the opposite of complaining? Appreciation. Have you ever been appreciative of something you were complaining about? That's like next level negativity. You're like, this is so great, I hate it. Right? Like, I don't know how you do that. So what's the opposite of blaming? Brene Brown says, accountability has an inverse relationship with blaming. So accountability. And here's the one thing about accountability. I'll give you the definition of it. Accountability is the ability to account for what happened without finding fault. Accountability is the ability to account for what happened without finding fault. If it's the opposite of blame, and blame is finding fault, you can't have accountability and still go find fault, because if you find fault in the accountability, it'll push you right back over to the negative cycle. So it's the ability to just account for it. Now think about like a business, right? Or real estate. If you have something that appreciates, it grows in value. And then when it starts to grow in value, you can look at your accounting in your spreadsheet and you just see this is what we do right and these are where our mistakes are, and there's no real emotion that's attached to it because you're okay, you're whole and you're complete and you're lacking no parts as you are, you're just in your human experience. Does that make sense? So no one is at fault. And if no one's at fault, well then the thing that we're going to all of a sudden start asking, the question is like, well, if they're not at fault, then what was happening? And here's what's happening, and you have to see it in yourself first before you can see it in other people, in my opinion. In this circumstance, everyone that was involved was just doing the very best they knew how, with what they had embodied at that time in their life. Embodiment means emotions, body, and mind. Knowledge means mind. Do you know more things than you know how to embody? Yeah. So everyone involved was just doing the very best they knew how to do in that moment. That will require personal revelation. Because you'll have evidence to prove that they weren't. And you'll have this assumption and this belief that they could have done better, or that you could have done better. What's the definition? There's one word. If you're doing the very best that you could in the moment that it was, that is the definition of empathy. Empathy means it was enough And that means that you were doing the very best that you knew how to do in that moment. This is the wrestle. This is where you'll dislocate your hip. Because you have all the evidence your whole life of, like, how you're not enough. And it's been a lie. And there's things that hurt people because you hurt them. And you've been hurt, and they hurt you. And so you have the evidence that you're not enough. So the wrestle that will dislocate your hip is to come to the moment where you realize that everyone involved, yourself especially, was just doing the very best you knew how to do. The metaphor I use is when Michael Jordan went to the free throw line, did he make every shot at the free throw line? Did he want to make every shot? Why didn't he do it? Because that's the human experience. You just don't make everything. You're just going to make mistakes. The most important part is to own your role in the situation. So the way you take accountability is one question. The question is, what was my role in this situation? That requires looking at your life through a mirror rather than a window. When you look through the window, you see what everyone else is doing and not doing. When you look in the mirror, you see what you're doing and what you're not doing. So everything is a mirror. And the mirror is really, really difficult to look into. The mirror is that all you have to do is ask one question. The question is, what was my role in the situation? And can you do it without finding fault in the other person? Here's why you don't want to take accountability. Because if, say you're in a divorce and the other person's over in their shadow story and you're trying to get into your shine story, and you're like, oh, I need to take accountability. Well, if they're over in their shadow story, they're looking for all the evidence to blame you with. And so then you're going to write a letter and be like, here's my whole role in the situation, and now you just fed them the whole damn evidence, right? Nobody wants to face that. And this is what was said in the New Testament. Don't worry about your reputation. Those that embody Christ consciousness have to sacrifice their reputation. Why are they sacrificing their reputation? Because they're accounting for this human experience, and when they account for it, they have to do that with people who are trying to find the fault. But here's the promise. If you dig a pit for your neighbor, you're the one that will fall in it. No one cares really what you did, and no one really gives a shit about, I'm sorry. What was the apology that was like, oh, thank you, when they just came to you and they're like, sorry. But when they came to you and they said, I just want to let you know this was my role in this situation. They never said sorry, they just said, this is what I did. You're like, that feels so good. The greatest apology is accountability and in identifying and owning up to your role in the circumstance. That's it. So the opposite of shame is empathy. Brene Brown said that empathy is the antidote to shame. And what's the opposite of judgment? It's observation. In the ancient record of Enoch, supposedly, and I actually believe this story, there's enough evidence behind it. This was a story where they built a community of oneness. They built a community where everyone's needs were met and everyone's wants were met. That sounds like a place we'd all, I think, like to be. They were known as the Watchers. In other words, the observers. In other words, they didn't judge each other. Does that make sense? So I then asked, going back to the story, the first healing miracle Jesus ever performed was healing his own emotional wounds and traumas, because once you can make peace within, then you can make peace with everything else outside of you. Right? Once you can walk on the stormy waters that are going on inside, then you can walk on the actual literal stormy waters on the outside. Because everything is just responding to us and to our beliefs and to where we're at. Right? So how do you make sense and heal your own emotional wounds and traumas? It depends on how you tell the story. Whether you're going to tell the shadow story or the shine story. And so this is just your little formula that you get to go home with and start to wrestle with who you are, the accountability and the role that you took place in the situation. Now this is really painful because some of this loss is really great. Right? And if we had more time, we could probably dive further into that. But what I wanted to do was to share with you the story of how you are the Christ as well. That's the promise. And if anyone wants to talk about more on that later, we can chat about it. It wasn't his last name, it's not your last name. It's just Christ consciousness. It's just the way to go about when you experience the abandonment, the abuse, the betrayal, and the rejection. And it's how to rewrite the story. So where the group that Alchemy that was doing that amazing sound session with us, they're coming down to the Homestead Ranch. That's where I'm located as well. We do retreats down there. They're 3-day retreats to rewrite your story, to take this and to really rewrite and make peace with it so that you tell it in this way. And what happens is that you end up healing your trauma. All we do is we're just editors and we just help you go, okay, that's complaining, okay, that's blaming, okay, let's dive a little bit deeper into that. And you just need a mentor to help you walk through. And luckily I've screwed up my life so fucking bad so many times. I'm really amazing at rewriting the story. So, thank you, I hope that makes sense.